And right now, time to welcome business commentator Rod Oram. Hi, Rod.
Good morning.
You have been looking back over the Crafar Farms decision, round 2. And what do you make of the latest decision, which is to confirm Shanghai Pengxin, or to approve its proposal to purchase the Crafar Farms again?
The economic case for approving the deal has actually gone backwards since the first decision, and I'll explain that in detail. And the government and the applicant have resorted to some very strange logic to try to bolster the economic case. And then lastly, the government has tried to cover up this weakness by stressing the non-economic benefits, such as protection of environmentally sensitive land, walking access and the like, which are very good things to do, and there is economic value, but it's not sort of the hardcore economic case. And on the central issue, which much more is made in this second approval, post the first approval being overturned by Justice Miller, is that this deal is crucial to the country's China trade strategy, but I'd like to deal with that too, because that is easy to knock back as well. And in fact, there's no evidence given for that. It's just said, well, this is in support of the strategy. But I will argue that, as we discussed, that actually it's a negative in terms of the trade strategy.
Well, let's start at the beginning, which was the initial deal was challenged by the courts, or sent back by the courts, because the argument was it had not properly addressed the core test. And just remind me of exactly what that is, which is that would the Chinese investors bring more benefit than local farmers taking over the farms? Just clarify what the actual test was.
In the first approval, the OIO chose a very low test, which was, would the farms be more productive in the hands of the bidder, Shanghai Pengxin, than they would be as they were? Well, that was clearly as a nonsense, because they were poorly run farms by the Crafar family, and then they've been run by receivers since. So the test that Justice Miller applied was a higher one, about demonstrating that the like for like is this overseas bidder versus a New Zealand bidder of reasonable quality and competence. And that's where the second approval goes backwards. So one of the key tests required by the Overseas Investment Act is whether the investment by a foreign purchaser will increase export receipts. Now, first time around, the OIO said yes. But this time around, applying that higher test, the second verdict is unknown. So, in other words, the OIO can't come to any judgment. My own view of that is that a New Zealand farmer, and quite likely an owner-investor rather than probably a corporate farmer, i.e. a share milker or somebody making their way in the world, would actually farm the land better than Shanghai Pengxin. So that's the first one, exports go backwards. And the other test that goes backwards is about processing in New Zealand. And again, the OIO seeks some uplift there. And in the first verdict in January, the OIO said yes, and in the second verdict is unknown. And in fact, there is less said about the extent to which Shanghai Pengxin will process here in this second verdict than the first. So those are the two main ones, but then there are other alleged economic gains which are highlighted as grounds for approval, but they don't actually make sense either.
In what way?
Right. The first one is jobs. So the first approval said this deal would lead to the retention and increase in jobs, and this time they're only talking about an increase in jobs. I'll let them have that point, that of course you need people to farm, so there would be job retention. However, the mighty job increase is 2 people, which is in a new dairy farming training facility, which Shanghai Pengxin has offered to invest in. The point I'd make about that is that if there is a failure in the dairy sector to train enough people, I think the dairy sector needs to deal with that properly. I don't think 2 employees in a shed on a Shanghai Pengxin farm is actually going to make any difference. Anyway, that's the first alleged economic gain. The second one is on-farm investment. Now, the first time around, the bidder was offering to spend $14 million up to 2016 in improving the farms, and that figure has gone up to $16 million. But it's not actually an outright increase, because the time frame's been just pushed out another year to 2017. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because trying to compare how Shanghai Pengxin is going to run these assets versus a New Zealand farmer, Landcorp, which is, of course, is a New Zealand government-owned, state-owned enterprise, and it will enter into an agreement to farm the land for Shanghai Pengxin, commissioned a study from Perrin Ag, an agricultural consultant, to compare its plans, Landcorp's plans for the farm, with, quote, the average New Zealand farmer. And this is the new evidence presented in an effort to meet Justice Miller's test. Now, Landcorp reckons that it already spends more than the average farmer on the likes of housing, regrassing, water supply, effluent management, new sheds, races, culverts and bridges. And indeed, it's proud of the money it spends improving the appearance of its farms to live up to Landcorp's, quote, farm pride standard. Well, that's jolly good. However, if that's all they do with this land when it's owned by the Chinese, it's a nonsense. Because first of all, in three ways. First of all, Landcorp is setting itself up as the paragon among farmers. Well, they're good, but they're not that good. Actually, some New Zealand farmers are better than they are. Secondly, if it had won the bid for these farms, it lost out to Shanghai Pengxin and indeed the Fay Consortium, both bid higher. If it had bought those farms itself, presumably it would have farmed up to its normal farm pride standard anyway. And thirdly, there is no evidence offered here that the Chinese owners are actually investing more than Landcorp would have done, or indeed any other New Zealand farmer would have done if they'd bought the farm instead.
But you hear this sitting within the wider context in the government's argument about its China strategy. Maurice Williamson released the letter that indicated that the pressures that were being brought to bear over the significance of turning this down. And you can go point by point through, as you have, the test. Does that belie or otherwise the government's core argument?
What is missing is any analysis of the government's core argument. Yes, Murray McCulley as foreign minister can write a pained letter to Maurice Williamson and Jonathan Coleman saying, look, this is going to be really embarrassing. This is obviously not his words. This is my paraphrase. This is going to be very hard for us to explain to the Chinese if you turn it down, and it's really important to the China Inc. strategy. Fair enough. That's an interesting point. Is there any analysis of that? No, there isn't in the OIO report. And in fact, the OIO, in one new piece of its recommendations, highlights 7 points which it said that the ministers were particularly keen on for approving this deal. 3 of them are economic. The first is the 2 jobs for the training facility. The second is that on-farm investment, which I both knocked back. And then the third one is, quote, giving effect to the advantage of New Zealand Inc. strategy. And one of the aims of that is to increase the bilateral investment levels in the 2 countries to reflect our growing commercial relationships. Okay, now that's a worthy goal, but let's consider that bilateral relationship. First of all, Fonterra is investing heavily in farms in China. It's just announced another $100 million investment for 2 more farms. That's good for Fonterra and its farmers, but it's very good for the Chinese economy because it's giving a little more secure milk supply. It represents a very large transfer of our farming skills to China, and I'm very relaxed about that. So there is very considerable economic gain to China and to New Zealand from that New Zealand investment. Now, if we're seeking balance in foreign investment between the 2 countries, the test should be, is this Chinese investment improving our technology and skills? And the OIO says, no, it actually turns down the application on that point. And secondly, this is a very nice deal for Shanghai Pengxin because they own supermarkets in China, so they can afford to farm here. They could even farm at a loss if they wanted to, and maybe they will farm at a loss because they're paying a very high price for this land. And they will take their profits in China at the supermarket till.
Do you make nothing then of the argument, and this came from Landcorp also, I think, when you're looking at the wider strategic opportunities of this deal, that very supermarket, the foot in the door that they have in the supermarket trade in New Zealand could have wider benefits for New Zealand as well. And this comes in a part of the world where relationships are an important part of doing business. Do you see no benefit in that connection?
Actually, the OIO itself said there was no benefits. It said that the market skills in China that were being offered by this were already in place in the in the New Zealand dairy sector. So, in fact, the OIO gave a big no to that. But I'll raise another...
Sorry, you said the skills in place. What do you mean by that?
In terms of the likes of Fonterra being actually a skilled marketer in China. And on that, in the very vague offer in Shanghai Pengxin's proposal or application for approval, there is some very vague stuff about how it's going to support New Zealand produce in its supermarkets. I make 2 points about that. First of all, the OIO one said actually that doesn't count because New Zealand is already pretty good at that. So that was actually a negative for Shanghai Pengxin. But here's the big one. Kathryn, we're talking here about a 100-year-old business model which has screwed New Zealand. I'm sorry, I can't be more blunt than that. Cast your mind back to the meat industry, for example, and the Vesti family from the UK, who own farms here, who own shipping, processing here. Weddell was their last company, and they own shipping, and they own the Dewhurst chain of butcher shops in the UK. We made a bit of money helping them farm that, and our exports look good, but very little of that stuck to the economic ribs of New Zealand. What Shanghai Pengxin is offering is a rerun of that 100-year-old model. That's how I can only be that blunt about it. And if you think that screwed up the meat industry, think how this is going to screw up the dairy industry.
Why then is the government so keen to do it? And the bottom line is not about sending a clear signal to China, to its companies, to its investors across the board. What possible rationale is there then?
I would argue that the government has neither the intelligence nor the courage to go to China and say, yes, we are extremely interested in your foreign investment in New Zealand, but let's make it like that foreign investment that's been very productive in other countries like Taiwan. Sorry, that's probably a bad example in the Chinese context, or Ireland. In other words, that enables us to do something we couldn't do ourselves. Shanghai Pengxin doesn't do that. But unfortunately, this government and its economic strategy actually doesn't understand that. All it's trying to push on it with is incremental growth of existing businesses, and is cutting some very dangerous corners in its failure to analyse that properly. And I would apply that to this. I would apply that to the casino issue here in Auckland, and I would apply it time and again to decisions it's made.